The air was crisp as the Reynolds family drove up the long gravel driveway to their new home, an imposing Victorian manor perched on a hill. Nestled in a remote corner of Massachusetts, the house had been a steal, a deal too good to pass up. Clara Reynolds, an artist seeking inspiration, had fallen in love with its charm the moment she saw the photos. Her husband, David, a software engineer, was less enthusiastic but agreed when Clara insisted it was the perfect environment to raise their 8-year-old daughter Lily. The house loomed ahead, its sharp gables and dark, weathered wood contrasting with the overcast sky. The windows were like eyes, reflecting the pale gray of the heavens, and the wraparound porch sagged ever so slightly, as though it carried the weight of countless secrets. A massive oak tree dominated the front yard, its gnarled branches clawing toward the house. The entire scene felt like something out of a Gothic painting. "This is it," Clara exclaimed, her voice tinged with excitement. "Isn't it gorgeous?" David parked the car, his brow furrowed. Gorgeous is one word for it. Creepy is another. Lily, clutching her stuffed rabbit, peered out the window. "I think it looks cool," she said, her wide eyes taking in every detail. "See?" Clara said, nudging David playfully. "Even Lily has better taste than you." But David couldn't shake the unease that prickled his skin as they stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence of the countryside was oppressive, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The real estate agent, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Wexler, met them on the porch. His eyes darted around as he handed over the keys. "Congratulations," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're going to love it here. So much history." David raised an eyebrow. "History?" Mr. Wexler hesitated. "Oh, nothing bad. Just old houses like this have stories. Character. That's all." Clara waved him off. "We love character." "Thank you, Mr. Wexler." As they stepped inside, the house seemed to sigh. The floors creaked beneath their feet, and the faint scent of mothballs and something metallic lingered in the air. The grand foyer opened into a maze of rooms, each filled with antique furniture left behind by the previous owners. Ornate chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their crystals catching the dim light. Lily ran ahead, her laughter echoing. "This place is like a castle," she shouted. Clara smiled. She's already in love with it. David frowned as he glanced at a painting on the wall, an unsettling portrait of a woman with cold, lifeless eyes. "I just hope it doesn't fall apart around us." Over the next few days, the family settled in. Clara spent her time in the spacious sunroom, painting landscapes inspired by the surrounding woods. David worked from the home office, struggling to get a strong internet connection in the remote location. Lily explored every corner of the house, her imagination running wild. But the house was far from silent. At night, David and Clara would wake to faint noises, whispers carried by the drafty halls, the distant sound of footsteps on the creaky floors, and the occasional slam of a door. "It's just the house settling," Clara would say, though her voice was less confident as the nights wore on. Lily, however, seemed unfazed. "I made a friend," she announced one morning at breakfast, her smile wide. Clara laughed. "Already? What's her name?" "Margaret," Lily said matter-of-factly. "She lives here." David paused, his fork hovering in midair. "Lives here?" "She says she's been here forever," Lily replied. "She's nice. She told me all about the secret door." "Secret door?" Clara asked, intrigued. Lily nodded. "She said it's in the basement." David and Clara exchanged a look. "We don't go in the basement," David said firmly. "It's not safe." Curiosity got the better of Clara. One afternoon, while David was on a conference call and Lily was playing outside, Clara decided to explore the basement. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the rickety stairs into the darkness. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with cobweb-covered furniture and boxes. As she scanned a room, her beam landed on something unusual, a small, unassuming wooden door built into the far wall. It was barely 4 feet tall, with rusted hinges and a handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. But then she thought of Lily's vivid imagination and smiled. "Just an old storage space," she whispered to herself as she pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow passageway lined with crumbling stone walls. The air was thick, and the faint smell of decay made her stomach churn. She took a cautious step inside, then another. At the end of the passage was a room, its walls covered in strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center was a wooden table, and on it lay a single object, a journal bound in cracked leather. Clara picked it up, her hands trembling. The first page was filled with spidery handwriting. "They must never leave," it read. "They are part of the house now." Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through the journal's brittle pages. The writing was erratic, as though the author had scrawled their thoughts in a frenzy. There were entries about strange occurrences, voices in the walls, objects moving on their own, and shadows that didn't belong to anyone. But the most chilling were the repeated warnings. The house is alive. A sudden noise, a faint creak, made Clara snap her head around. Her flashlight wavered as she scanned the passage, but there was nothing there. Just the dark. Her heart racing, she stuffed the journal under her arm and hurried back up the stairs. The basement door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. That evening, Clara shared her discovery with David after putting Lily to bed. He stared at the journal skeptically, flipping through the pages. "This has to be a joke," he said. "Some kind of old ghost story left by the previous owners." Clara shook her head. "What if it's not?" "David, I swear, there's something off about this place." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're in an old house. Of course it's going to have quirks. You're letting Lily's stories get to you." "Then explain this," Clara said, pointing to the journal. "Explain why someone would write about the house being alive. Why there's a hidden door leading to whatever that room is." David set the journal down. "I'll check it out tomorrow. But Clara, you need to calm down. Lily doesn't need to see us acting like scared kids." Clara wanted to argue, but the exhaustion from the day and the lingering fear made her relent. "Fine, but promise me you'll take this seriously." "I will," David said, though his tone lacked conviction. That night, Clara's sleep was restless. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the wood as it expanded and contracted in the cold. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but growing louder. "Clara!" She jolted awake, her heart pounding. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. She shook David awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "The whispers," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Someone said my name?" David sat up, listening, but the house was silent. "Clara, it's your imagination," he said. "Go back to sleep." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been in the room with them. True to his word, David went to the basement the next morning. He found the small door just as Clara had described and stepped inside the passage. The air was damp, and the faint smell of rot clung to his nostrils. When he reached the room at the end, he saw the carvings Clara had mentioned, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light of his flashlight. The journal had mentioned binding the house to its keepers, and David found himself unnerved by the implications. He decided to take photos of the carvings to research later. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the floor, footprints in the dust. Small, bare footprints leading out of the room. "Lily?" he called, his voice echoing. No response. David hurried back upstairs, his mind racing. When he found Clara in the kitchen, she was pale, her eyes wide. "What is it?" David asked. "Lily. She said Margaret told her not to let you disturb the basement," Clara said. "She was so serious, David. It scared me." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Where is Lily now?" "She's in her room." "Why?" Without answering, David rushed to Lily's room. She was sitting on the floor, drawing with crayons. When she looked up, her expression was calm, but her eyes seemed distant. "Daddy," she said, "Margaret doesn't like you." David crouched down beside her. "Lily, who is Margaret?" "She's the lady who lives in the house," Lily said. "She said it's her house, and we're just visiting." The days that followed were a blur of strange events. Lights flickered even when the power was stable. Doors opened and closed on their own. Clara's paintings, once vibrant, began to twist into dark, unsettling images she couldn't explain. One night, Clara woke to find Lily standing at the foot of their bed. Her eyes were open, but she was eerily still. "Lily?" Clara said, her voice trembling. "She says we have to leave," Lily whispered, her voice flat. "Before it's too late." David sat up, his face pale. "Lily, who said that?" But Lily didn't answer. She simply turned and walked back to her room, her movements stiff and unnatural. Desperate for answers, Clara decided to visit the local library. What she found made her blood run cold. The house, known locally as the Blackwood Manor, had a dark history. Over a century ago, a woman named Margaret Blackwood had lived there. She was a recluse and rumored to dabble in the occult. Villagers spoke of disappearances, strange lights in the woods, and chilling screams coming from the house. Margaret had vanished without a trace, and the house had been abandoned for decades. Clara hurried home, her heart pounding. "David," she said, bursting through the door. "Margaret is real. She stopped short. David was standing in the living room, staring at the journal. But his expression was blank, his eyes glazed over. "David," Clara said, her voice trembling. He turned to her slowly, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. It was deep, guttural, and cold. "You should have stayed away," he said. The house came alive that night. Walls groaned, windows shattered, and the air was filled with an unearthly wail. Clara grabbed Lily and tried to flee, but the front door wouldn't budge. David, or whatever had taken control of him, stood at the top of the stairs, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "She belongs to the house now," he said. Clara clutched Lily tightly. "You can't have her." The journal. Clara realized it was the key. She grabbed it from the table and began tearing out pages, shouting the words written there. The house screamed in protest, and the walls began to crack. In a final, desperate act, Clara lit the journal on fire and threw it into the fireplace. The house convulsed, and the oppressive presence that had surrounded them lifted. David collapsed, unconscious but alive. They escaped into the night, the house burning behind them. Months later, the Reynolds family had moved into a modest apartment in the city. Clara's paintings were bright and full of life again, and David never spoke of the events at Blackwood Manor. But Lily, while playing one afternoon, whispered to her stuffed rabbit. "She'll find us again," she said, smiling. "Margaret always does." Story 2. The Peterson family needed a change. After years of scraping by in a cramped apartment in Queens, Mark's sudden job loss had been the tipping point. Sarah, his wife of 12 years, had suggested leaving the city altogether. "We need space," she'd said. "For us. For Ella. For a fresh start." Mark wasn't entirely convinced. He'd always been a practical man, favoring routine over risk. But Sarah, with her dreamer's heart, had been persistent. And so, when the farmhouse listing appeared on Sarah's late-night Zillow search, a sprawling Victorian property nestled in upstate New York, Mark agreed to see it. "It's perfect," Sarah had said, her hazel eyes lighting up as they toured the house. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of a gravel road, framed by a sea of golden fields. Its red-painted exterior had faded to a muted rust color, and the white trim around its windows had started to peel. But there was something undeniably charming about it, a stubborn beauty that refused to be erased by time. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its boards creaking underfoot. 2 stories loomed above, crowned with a steeply pitched roof and a narrow attic window that seemed to watch them as they approached. "Picturesque, isn't it?" Mrs. Harrington, the real estate agent, had said, flashing a wide smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was a short woman with tightly curled gray hair and a wardrobe that seemed frozen in the 1980s. "The house has been on the market for quite some time, but I just know it's waiting for the right family." "Why so long?" Mark had asked, his tone wary. Mrs. Harrington had waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how people are these days. They want new construction, modern amenities. They don't appreciate the character of a place like this." Sarah was sold. "We'll take it." The first days in the farmhouse were a blur of unpacking. Sarah, ever the artist, saw potential in every corner. She envisioned the kitchen with fresh paint and open shelving, The living room with a gallery wall of family photos. It's going to be beautiful, she kept saying, as if willing the house to transform through sheer enthusiasm. Ella, their 10-year-old daughter, was less enthusiastic. She was a shy, introspective child, with large blue eyes that always seemed on the verge of tears. Moving away from the city and her few friends had been hard on her. Sarah hoped the countryside would help Ella's anxiety, giving her the peace she desperately needed. "I don't like it here," Ella whispered to her father on their second night in the house. Mark knelt beside her, smoothing her blonde hair. "You'll get used to it, kiddo. It's just new." But Ella wasn't convinced. She hated the silence of the farmhouse at night, the way the wind seemed to sigh through the old walls. And there was something about the attic window, something that made her shiver whenever she glanced up at it. The footsteps began on the third night. Sarah was in the living room, arranging books on the built-in shelves, when she heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of floorboards above her head. She froze, her pulse quickening. The sound moved steadily across the ceiling, stopping just above where she stood. "Mark," she called, though she knew her husband was in the kitchen, fixing the leaky faucet. He appeared a moment later, a wrench in hand. "What's up? Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice low. Mark listened. The footsteps had stopped. He shrugged. Probably the house settling. Sarah wasn't so sure. The sound had been too purposeful, too human. But she nodded, brushing it off. "Yeah, probably." The attic door was a peculiar feature of the house. Unlike the other doors, which were tall and paneled, the attic door was short and plain, barely reaching Sarah's shoulder. It sat at the end of the upstairs hallway, nestled between Ella's bedroom and the linen closet. Ella was the first to notice it. "Why is that door so small?" she asked one afternoon, her voice tinged with unease. "Maybe it's for storage," Sarah said, crouching to inspect it. The brass handle was tarnished, and the door itself seemed warped, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. "It feels weird," Ella said, her brow furrowing. "It's just a door, sweetheart," Sarah assured her. But she couldn't deny the odd, heavy feeling that settled over her whenever she walked past it. The Petersons weren't entirely alone in their new life. Their nearest neighbor, Dr. Philip Huxley, lived 2 miles down the road in a modest brick cottage. He was an elderly man, retired from his career as a history professor, with a sharp mind and a penchant for local lore. Sarah met him at the town's farmer's market one Saturday. "You're the new folks in the farmhouse," he said, his deep-set eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes," Sarah said. "It's a bit of a project, but we love it." Huxley's smile faltered. "Be careful with that house," he said. "It has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Old houses carry stories. Some are best left untold." Ella's drawings began to change. At first, they were innocent sketches of flowers and animals. But soon, darker images appeared. Shadowy figures with elongated limbs, a staircase disappearing into blackness, a small, eerie door. When Sarah found one such drawing, a tall figure labeled Mr. Gray, she felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's Mr. Gray?" she asked. "He lives in the attic," Ella said matter-of-factly. Sarah frowned. "Ella, there's no one in the attic." "Yes, there is," Ella insisted. "He talks to me at night. He says he wants to meet you." Mark's work in the basement revealed something unsettling. A hidden room. Behind a stack of rotting wood, he found a narrow doorway leading to a small, circular space with stone walls. The room was empty except for a series of strange symbols etched into the floor, symbols that sent a shiver down his spine. He showed Sarah that evening, and she called Dr. Huxley for advice. The old professor arrived the next day, his expression grim as he examined the carvings. "These are binding runes," he explained. "Symbols used in certain rituals to trap spirits or entities." "What kind of entity?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Huxley looked at her, his face grave. "Something that should never be freed." The house grew hostile after that. Doors slammed without warning. Lights flickered even when the wiring was inspected. Mark began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with no memory of his nightmares. Ella grew paler, quieter. "He's angry," she whispered one morning. "He doesn't like that you found the room." "Who's angry?" Mark asked. "Mr. Gray," Ella said. "He wants us to leave." The night the house attacked, the Petersons were gathered in the living room. A deafening bang echoed from the attic, followed by the sound of footsteps, fast, frantic, coming closer. "We're leaving," Sarah said, grabbing Ella's hand. But the front door wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't open. The air grew heavy, filled with a low, guttural growl. Mark grabbed the crowbar he'd left by the fireplace and headed for the attic. "Stay here," he told Sarah. "No," Sarah cried, but he was already gone. Mark never returned. When Sarah and Ella finally broke a window and fled into the night, they looked back to see the attic window glowing faintly. A figure stood there, watching them, a shadowy, elongated figure. They drove away and never returned. Story 3. Emma and Daniel Hathaway had spent years dreaming of a life far removed from the chaos of the city. After exhausting hours of office work and the deafening grind of urban life, the promise of peace had drawn them like moths to a flame. A Victorian-style house nestled in the dense forests of Vermont seemed the perfect escape. It was the kind of home they had only seen in movies. 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch, a widow's walk at the top, and large bay windows that promised views of a star-speckled sky. When they found out it was being sold far below market value, their hesitation was brief. The realtor mentioned the old age of the house and an elderly owner who had passed away, but nothing seemed overtly suspicious. Emma, ever the pragmatist, asked about inspections, repairs, and history. Daniel, eager to make the dream a reality, had waved her concerns away. "It's perfect," he had said, and for the first few days it was. But soon, they began to question if dreams could become nightmares. The day the Hathaways moved in was bathed in golden autumn light. The leaves outside the house had turned shades of amber and crimson, and the chill in the air made everything feel crisp and alive. The house, however, had a different aura. Its paint, once white, had faded into a dull, peeling gray. Vines crept up the walls, clutching at the eaves like skeletal fingers. Despite its imperfections, Emma couldn't help but admire its character. A wide, creaking porch stretched across the front, its wooden swing swaying faintly in the breeze. "I can't believe this is ours," Daniel said, stepping onto the porch with a grin. Emma offered a small smile, her arms folded tightly. "It's beautiful," she replied, though something about the way the house loomed over them gave her pause. Inside, the house was colder than she expected. Shadows pooled in the corners of the high-ceilinged rooms, and the faint smell of damp wood and mothballs hung in the air. The furniture left behind by the previous owner seemed out of place, as if it belonged to another era. "This is charming," Daniel said, looking at a grandfather clock standing tall and silent in the hallway. "Charming is one word," Emma muttered, eyeing the cracked wallpaper. "Haunted is another." Daniel laughed and nudged her playfully. "Come on, it's just old." Old, yes. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than that. It felt alive, watchful, as if its walls harbored memories that refused to be forgotten. The first night in the house was uneventful. The couple unpacked the essentials, cooked a simple dinner on the antique gas stove, and fell asleep under the weight of their exhaustion. It wasn't until the second night that the house began to make its presence known. Emma woke in the middle of the night to a faint sound. At first, she thought it was the wind rattling the old windows, but as she lay still, straining her ears, she heard it again, the distinct creak of footsteps on the stairs. She nudged Daniel. "Wake up." "What?" He groaned, his voice muffled by the pillow. "Someone's in the house," she whispered. Daniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. The sound came again, soft, deliberate steps descending the staircase. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, his tone firm. Emma watched as he crept out of the bedroom, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Moments stretched into eternity as she waited, her heart hammering in her chest. Finally, Daniel returned, shaking his head. "No one's here. It's probably just the house settling," he said, climbing back into bed. But Emma wasn't convinced. The sound of footsteps didn't feel random or mechanical. They felt purposeful, A week passed, and the strange occurrences escalated. Doors that had been shut were found open. Objects went missing, only to reappear in places neither of them had left them. One morning, Emma discovered a series of deep scratches gouged into the wood of the guest bedroom door. Daniel dismissed it as the work of a raccoon that had somehow gotten inside. Emma's unease grew, and she began exploring the house in search of answers. One afternoon, she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air grew colder the higher she went, and the light streaming through the small attic window cast long, warped shadows across the cluttered space. The attic was a repository of forgotten relics. Dusty trunks, yellowed newspapers, and furniture shrouded in white sheets. At the center of the room was a wooden rocking chair, facing the window. It rocked faintly, though there was no breeze. Emma's stomach tightened. She stepped closer, noticing something carved into the armrest of the chair. It was the name Lydia. As she stared at the name, a sudden creak echoed through the attic. She spun around, but no one was there. She backed away from the chair and fled downstairs, her heart pounding. When she told Daniel about the chair, he laughed. "It's just an old piece of furniture, Em. Don't let your imagination run wild." But Emma wasn't so sure. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, its very walls thrumming with a quiet menace. She decided to return to the attic, determined to understand the strange energy that seemed to emanate from the space. This time, she brought a flashlight and searched the trunks and boxes. In one of the trunks, she found a journal bound in cracked leather. The name Lydia Hartwell was inscribed on the first page. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor and began to read. Lydia's entries were mundane at first, filled with descriptions of gardening and social events. But as the journal progressed, the tone darkened. "I hear him at night," one entry read. "His footsteps echo through the halls, though no one is there. He watches me from the shadows. I feel his presence in my dreams, calling to me." Emma's breath quickened as she flipped through the pages. The final entry chilled her to the bone. "He is always here waiting. I cannot escape him. He knows my fears, my thoughts, my every move. The house is his, and now so am I." The entry ended with a jagged line, as if Lydia had been interrupted. Emma clutched the journal to her chest and hurried downstairs. When she tried to show it to Daniel the next morning, the journal was gone. The following days were a blur of terror. The noises in the house grew louder, more insistent. Shadows moved where no light should have cast them. The rocking chair in the attic appeared in different rooms without explanation. One night, as they sat in the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly. The lights flickered and a low, guttural growl resonated through the house. Emma grabbed Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What is that?" she whispered. Before he could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its face was featureless, save for deep, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Emma screamed as the figure advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural. Daniel grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and swung it wildly, but the figure dissolved into darkness before their eyes. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, his bravado finally shattered. First thing in the morning, when morning came, the couple packed hastily, throwing essentials into suitcases. But as they tried to leave, they discovered that the house had other plans. The front door wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, their frames unyielding no matter how hard Daniel pried. Outside, the driveway was blocked by a massive tree that had fallen during the night. "It's not letting us leave," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. Desperate, Daniel decided to confront the entity. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, he led Emma to the basement, where the malevolent energy was strongest. The basement was a labyrinth of stone walls, its air damp and suffocating. At the center of the room stood the shadowy figure, waiting. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with an oppressive dread. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes fixed on them. In a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers, it replied, "This is my home. You are trespassers." The room erupted in chaos. The walls trembled, objects flew through the air, and a deafening roar filled their ears. Emma clung to Daniel, her vision blurring as the darkness closed in around them. When the house was listed for sale again, the realtor assured potential buyers that the previous owners had simply moved away unexpectedly. The new family who purchased it found the house charming, with its Victorian architecture and old-world charm. But on their first night, as they settled into their new home, they heard a faint tapping sound coming from within the walls. And upstairs, in the attic, the rocking chair began to move. Story 4. The Hendersons arrived under a sky the color of a bruise, the late afternoon sun a smudged thumbprint behind the gathering clouds. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel, the worn leather slick beneath his palms. The sprawling wilderness seemed to press in, the gnarled trees lining the dirt road like skeletal sentinels guarding a dark secret. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched by something ancient and unseen. Ahead, the mansion materialized from the gloom, a Gothic monstrosity silhouetted against the bruised sky. Its turrets clawed at the heavens, and its countless windows, dark and vacant, stared back at them like empty sockets. It wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum waiting to be filled. Emily's breath hitched, all ward with a deep-seated apprehension as she took in the decaying grandeur of their new home. The mansion was a relic of a bygone era, untouched by the sterile hand of modernity. Tattered ivy, like grasping claws, clung to the aged stone, threatening to drag the whole structure back into the earth. A sudden gust of wind rattled the skeletal remains of the garden hedges, their dry branches scratching against each other like whispering bones. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. In the back, Sam felt a disconcerting sense of déjà vu, a prickling familiarity with a place he'd never been. Phantom memories, not his own, flickered at the edges of his awareness, whispering of shadowed halls and half-forgotten faces. Each turn of the wheels felt like a step closer to an inevitable, unsettling destiny. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Beside him, Lucy, still cocooned in the blissful ignorance of childhood, hugged her worn teddy bear. The mist swirling around the mansion transformed it into a shadowy behemoth, a castle from a grim fairy tale. She saw movement in the periphery, fleeting shapes dancing across the weathered stone, too quick to be real, yet too persistent to ignore. Her eyes, wide with a child's wonder, saw not menace, but magic. The car crunched to a stop on the gravel drive, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. John, needing to take charge, was the first out, his boots striking the gravel like hammer blows. He climbed the steps, his gaze fixed on the massive, varnished doors. They seemed to sigh as he approached, as if burdened by the weight of centuries. The mansion, he realized, was watching them, patiently waiting, its darkened windows gleaming like the eyes of a predator. Emily lingered by the wrought iron gates, their rusted hinges frozen in a perpetual half-open state. A chill radiated from the metal as her fingers brushed against it, a ghostly handshake with the past. Above her, the mansion's turrets pierced the swirling mist, their sharp silhouettes like accusing fingers pointing at the darkening sky. The air thickened, the wind holding its breath as if anticipating their next move. The porch groaned under their combined weight, each creak a testament to the passage of time, the echoes of footsteps long faded. The very would seem to whisper stories of lives lived and lost within these walls. A dissonant melody drifted from the rustling leaves, a mournful tune played by an unseen orchestra. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach, a premonition of the darkness that lay within. John's knock echoed through the stillness, a hollow thud that reverberated through the unseen chambers of the house. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. Emily imagined she could hear whispers again, threading through the wood, unintelligible murmurings from a world beyond their own. Their breath plumed in the cold air, ghostly apparitions that vanished into the gathering gloom. Lucy's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, her face alight with a childlike curiosity that bordered on the unnerving. For her, the mansion was an enchanted castle, a place of untold adventures. But for the others, the mansion's stoic grandeur held a chilling promise, a silent warning of the secrets it held within. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing a cavernous darkness beyond. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and the chilling touch of something unseen. The Hendersons stepped across the threshold, and the mansion held its breath. John's heavy knock echoed through the breathless silence, swallowed by the looming facade. Then, a groan of protesting hinges, and the door swung inward, revealing a cavernous darkness within. The air that spilled out was not merely cold, but clammy, a ghostly exhalation that snaked around their ankles and clung to their skin. It smelled of dust and time, and something faintly acrid, like the phantom scent of decay. He stepped across the threshold, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. The foyer was vast, swallowed by shadows that seemed to shift and coalesce even in the stillness. The marble floor, a checkerboard of pale gray and ghostly white, was worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, each echoing step a whisper from the past. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes, or the suggestion of eyes in the dimness, seeming to follow them with a mournful, unsettling intensity. They were faded, the colors muted by time, but the expressions, those remained, a silent chorus of sorrow and a hint of something else, something watchful. John's voice, when he called out to Emily and the children, sounded thin and reedy in the echoing space, the syllables swallowed by the heavy drapes that shrouded the tall windows. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, clung to the corners of the ceiling, whispering their own silent stories of neglect and decay. Emily followed, her hand trailing along the smooth, worn wood of the banister. It was polished to a glassy sheen, but beneath her fingertips, she felt the faintest tremor, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the house. The sensation prickled her skin, a sense of being observed, of being listened to. The faded carpet underfoot muffled her steps, but she felt a strange yielding beneath the worn fibers, as if she were walking on a bed of sighs. The rooms branched off the central hallway, each a pocket of stagnant air and hushed expectancy. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the heavy drapes, each mote a tiny, swirling ghost. Lucy, ever drawn to the whimsical, peered into a darkened parlor, her eyes wide with a childlike wonder that bordered on the unsettling. She saw not decay, but possibility, imagining hidden passageways and secret rooms, a playground of mystery waiting to be explored. Sam, however, felt a growing unease. He lagged behind, a cold dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He felt a weight on his shoulders, an unseen gaze boring into him, a probing awareness that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Shadows danced in the corners of his eyes, whispering his name with the rustle of dead leaves, beckoning him closer, promising secrets too terrible to comprehend. A dull thud echoed from the floor above, followed by the unsettling crackle of a fire that couldn't be seen. A chill breeze snaked through the hallway, stirring the heavy drapes and making them billow like phantom figures trying to escape. Emily paused by a grimy window, her gaze drawn to the churning sky outside, then back to the oppressive stillness within. The house seemed to breathe around them, a slow, shallow inhalation that held a hint of something hungry. John pushed open a door to reveal a parlor, once grand, now suffocating under the weight of years. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghostly sentinels, their shapes hinting at a forgotten opulence. The walls, a somber slate gray, seemed to absorb the light, casting the room into a perpetual twilight. An ornate fireplace, its carvings intricate and disturbingly familiar, dominated one wall, and a shiver ran down John's spine, a cold premonition that defied the faint warmth of the afternoon sun struggling to penetrate the grime-coated windows. An unseen current seemed to tug at them, pulling them deeper into the house's embrace. Lucy, oblivious to the growing tension, skipped ahead, drawn by a soft, murmuring voice that only she could hear. Her hand brushed against a damp wall, and she felt a faint vibration, a pulse of energy that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Her youthful curiosity, unburdened by fear, saw only wonder in the house's mysteries, while the rest felt the chilling tendrils of dread tightening around them. The whispers were starting, soft and insidious, weaving themselves into the fabric of the house, a prelude to the terrors to come. The last of the day's light bled from the leaded glass windows, staining the dust motes swirling in the air a bruised purple. The house, having revealed its physical form, now began to exhale its essence, a creeping dread that seeped from the walls like a noxious gas. The whispers, barely audible at first, with a rustling of unseen silk, the sigh of a phantom breath against the back of their necks. The shadows, once mere playful distortions of the fading light, lengthened and deepened, taking on the subtle suggestion of movement, the hint of forms coalescing in the periphery. Emily, her senses always attuned to the unseen currents of the world, felt the shift most keenly. A chill prickled her skin, not from the cooling air, but from a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature in the very marrow of her bones. The ghostly lullaby she'd heard earlier in the kitchen sharpened, the bittersweet melody now laced with a discordant note, a tremor of sorrow that vibrated in her chest. The knife slipped in her hand, slicing through the apple skin with a sound unnervingly like a whispered scream. Jean, his mind a fortress of logic and reason, felt the pressure building in his temples. The musty smell of the house, which he'd initially dismissed as the scent of age and disuse, now seemed to cling to him, a cloying perfume of decay. He saw movement in the corners of his eyes, fleeting glimpses of darkness that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He told himself it was his imagination, the product of an overactive mind in an unfamiliar environment, but a knot of unease tightened in his gut. Sam, seeking refuge in the attic's dusty expanse, found no sanctuary. The whispers here were different, not the mournful crooning that haunted his mother, but harsh, sibilant pronouncements that slithered into his thoughts. They pricked at him with half-formed images, flashes of violence and despair. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the visions only intensified, swirling behind his eyelids like a macabre kaleidoscope. Lucy, blessed with the unburdened perception of childhood, saw the shadows as playmates, their shifting forms an invitation to a silent game of hide-and-seek. The whispers, to her ears, were secrets being shared, stories whispered on the wind. Drawn by an unseen hand, she found herself in the nursery, a room choked with the ghosts of forgotten children. She traced the faded patterns on the walls, her small fingers dancing over scenes of pastoral bliss, oblivious to the undercurrent of sorrow that permeated the room. As darkness enveloped the mansion, the whispers intensified, no longer subtle suggestions but insistent pronouncements that burrowed into their minds. The shadows, emboldened by the night, stretched and contorted, their movements mimicking the dance of flames in the hearth, a mesmerizing ballet of darkness. Emily retreated to the study, seeking solace in the familiar comfort of her books, but the words on the page blurred, replaced by the spectral script of the whispers. Jean, his skepticism crumbling under the weight of the unseen, paced the hallways, the portraits of his ancestors seeming to mock him with their knowing gazes. The house held its breath, poised on the precipice of revelation. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices vying for their attention, their sanity. The stage was set for confrontation. The insidious whispers, once a subtle undercurrent, now clawed at the edges of sanity, amplified by the encroaching darkness. The moon, a spectral eye peering through the skeletal branches of the ancient trees, painted the mansion's facade in a chilling silver light, etching its decaying grandeur against the inky canvas of the night. The very air thrummed with an oppressive weight, a palpable anticipation of the inevitable confrontation with the secrets festering within the mansion's heart. John bolted upright in bed, his skin slick with a cold sweat, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to him like cobwebs. Shadowy figures danced at the periphery of his vision, their skeletal fingers reaching, grasping, pulling him back into the suffocating depths of his dream. He reached for Emily, a desperate yearning for the anchor of her presence, but found only the cold emptiness of the sheets beside him. A knot of dread tightened in his chest, propelling him towards the study, drawn by an unseen force to where Emily sought refuge from the encroaching darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath his bare feet, each creak a whispered word in the mansion's growing chorus of unease. The portraits lining the hallway seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision, their eyes, dull and lifeless in the moonlight, following his every move. He found Emily huddled in the study, the flickering flame of a single candle casting long, dancing shadows that distorted the familiar room into a grotesque parody. Her face, etched with a stark weariness, was illuminated by the fragile light, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the tight lines around her mouth. She was lost in the pages of a leather-bound journal, her fingers tracing the faded script as if seeking answers in the ghostly whispers of the past. As John entered, her gaze snapped up, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared understanding of the terror that held them captive. Emily's voice, barely a whisper, rasped through the stillness, revealing the journal's grim contents. It spoke of a prisoner trapped within the mansion's walls, tormented by an unseen presence, driven to the brink of madness by the relentless whispers. The words, penned in a hand trembling with fear and desperation, resonated with a chilling familiarity, echoing the growing dread that gnawed at John's own sanity. A thread of connection, spun across the years, bound them to the prisoner's anguish, intertwining their fate with the mansion's dark history. Meanwhile, Sam and Lucy, oblivious to the unfolding horror, were drawn by an inexplicable curiosity to the abandoned nursery. The air within the room hung heavy with the ghosts of laughter and forgotten lullabies. Lucy, her innocence a shield against the encroaching darkness, saw not a room of decay, but a canvas of stories waiting to be told. She whispered to the shadows, coaxing forth the echoes of children long gone, their playful spirits swirling around her like unseen companions. Lucy's whispers transformed into vivid narratives, painting a picture of a time when the nursery echoed with the joyful cries of children. She spoke of hidden passages and secret games, her words breathing life back into the dust-filled room. Her voice, filled with an unsettling certainty, urged Sam towards the oubliette, a dark stain on the mansion's history. Sam, his initial hesitation dissolving under the weight of his sister's unnerving conviction, followed her down the winding staircase, a growing sense of foreboding clinging to him like the cold, damp air of the descending passage. Their paths converged in the basement, the heart of the mansion's darkness. The air grew thick and suffocating, the silence punctuated by the drip, drip, drip of unseen water. The shadows pulsed with a malevolent energy, pressing against them, whispering secrets of unimaginable cruelty. The very stones seemed to weep with the weight of the atrocities they had witnessed. Emily's voice, trembling but resolute, broke the oppressive silence. This house it wants us to see. Acknowledge it. Its history. Its loss. We must face it together. John's hand found Emily's, their fingers intertwining, a silent pact forged in the face of fear. As one, they turned to face the darkness, their hearts pounding in unison with the mansion's ancient, malevolent rhythm. The shadows coalesced, swirling and twisting, taking on grotesque, fleeting forms. Whispers rose to a cacophony, a chorus of screams and lamentations that threatened to shatter their sanity. Lucy, her eyes wide and unblinking, reached out a hand, her touch seeming to calm the swirling chaos. A hush descended, fragile and tentative, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. The spectral figures solidified, their forms shimmering in the dim light. Faces, etched with pain and sorrow, emerged from the darkness, their eyes fixed on the Hendersons, not with malice, but with a profound sadness. John felt a wave of empathy wash over him, a visceral understanding of their suffering. The mansion, no longer a menacing presence, felt like a wounded creature, yearning for release. They stood together, the living and the dead, bound by the shared history of the house, poised on the precipice of revelation. The shared confession in the mansion's oppressive heart became a fragile bridge, spanning the chasm between the living and the spectral. The oppressive darkness that had clung to the Hendersons like a shroud began to dissipate, replaced by a mist that swirled not with menace, but with the remnants of untold stories. It coiled around the grand pillars of the hallway, an ethereal serpent shedding its skin of fear. The whispers remained, but their tone had shifted from chilling threats to sorrowful lullabies, imbued with a strange, melancholic understanding. The family, huddled together moments before in terror, now stood bathed in the soft luminescence of this spectral fog, feeling the house enfold them, not in a grasp of malice, but in an embrace of shared history. Each dusty corner, each creaking stair tread, whispered of a past that now bound them, not in fear, but in a silent vow of acceptance. The shadows, once monstrous figures lurking at the periphery of their vision, softened, their edges blurring into translucent veils. Behind these gauzy curtains, the house's former inhabitants seemed to peer out, not with malevolence, but with a solemn reverence, their spectral forms forever intertwined with the mansion's narrative. John stood in the grand hall, sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, painting him in hues of amethyst and emerald. The oppressive weight that had settled on his chest in the basement now lifted, leaving a strange hollowness in its wake. The air, thick with the dust of ages, seemed to listen, to breathe in unison with him. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the portraits lining the walls. Their eyes, once accusatory, now seemed filled with a weary resignation, witnesses to a history he was finally beginning to understand. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the cold, smooth surface of a mahogany panel. He spoke, his voice a low murmur in the vast stillness, words of apology, of understanding, directed not to the empty air, but to the house itself. Emily's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent affirmation of their shared journey. The bond between them, tested in the crucible of fear, had been forged anew, stronger, more resilient. Emily returned to the study, drawn back to the source of their unsettling revelations. The room, once a sanctuary shattered by spectral whispers, now felt like a haven. She sat at the antique desk, her fingers tracing the faded script in the journal. The words, chronicling the despair and anguish of a long-dead resident, no longer filled her with dread. She read aloud, her voice giving life to the forgotten stories, weaving a tapestry of sorrow and resilience. As she spoke, the room seemed to respond, the spectral forms coalescing, no longer grotesque apparitions, but faces etched with the familiar lines of grief and regret. They listened, their ethereal forms shimmering in the candlelight, as Emily gave voice to their silenced narratives. In that shared space of sorrow and understanding, a strange kinship blossomed, a connection that transcended time, binding her to the house and its history in a way she never could have imagined. Lucy's laughter echoed through the nursery, a bright, melodic counterpoint to the somber history of the mansion. Her innocent joy filled the room, chasing away the lingering shadows, breathing life back into the faded murals on the walls. She danced among the dust motes, her presence a beacon, illuminating the darkened corners of the past. Sam watched her, a slow smile spreading across his face. The skepticism that had been his shield had finally crumbled, replaced by a burgeoning sense of wonder. He saw not ghosts, but echoes, remnants of lives lived, loved, and lost within these very walls. He felt a connection to the unseen, a sense of belonging he hadn't expected, a unity not forged in fear, but in acceptance. Together, the family explored the mansion anew. Each room, once a source of terror, now offered a glimpse into the past. They walked the creaking floorboards, their footsteps echoing through the silent halls, not as intruders, but as inheritors of a legacy, both tragic and beautiful. The house, sensing their shift in perception, seemed to exhale, its oppressive weight lifting. The shadows retreated, the whispers softened, the very air seemed to lighten. The mansion, once a daunting edifice, now felt like a silent guardian, its stories woven into the fabric of their lives. In the basement, the epicenter of their fear, they stood hand in hand, facing the remnants of the mansion's darkest secrets. The cold, damp air still held the echoes of past suffering, but now, bathed in the soft glow of understanding, the shadows no longer held their power. They acknowledged the pain, the loss, the darkness, but they did not let it consume them. They stood together, a family united, not by fear, but by a shared experience that had transformed them, forging a bond stronger than any they had known before. The house, sensing their acceptance, seemed to sigh, its ancient timbers groaning as if releasing a burden carried for centuries. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the mansion began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of peace, a quiet reverence for the lives that had been lived and lost within its walls. The mansion, weathered and worn by time, began to soften. Cracks in the plaster seemed less like scars and more like the lines etched on a beloved face. The peeling paint revealed layers of history, each hue a testament to a different era. The Hendersons began to see the house not as a haunted prison, but as a living, breathing entity imbued with the memories of generations past. They began to care for it, not out of obligation, but out of a newfound respect, a desire to preserve its stories, to honor its past. They worked together, clearing the overgrown gardens, planting new seeds in the fertile earth. John repaired broken shutters and mended crumbling window frames. Emily cleaned and polished the antique furniture, uncovering the beauty hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect. Lucy filled the rooms with her laughter, her vibrant energy breathing life back into the silent halls. Sam explored the attic and the library, poring over old books and photographs, piecing together the fragmented narratives of the mansion's past. With each act of restoration, they wove their own stories into the fabric of the house, creating a new chapter in its long and complex history. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the lawn, the Hendersons gathered on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The mansion, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, stood as a silent sentinel, no longer a place of fear, but a sanctuary, a home. They were no longer merely inhabitants, but custodians, entrusted with the care of its history, its secrets, its soul. The whispers remained, but now they were not the chilling pronouncements of restless spirits, but the gentle murmurings of a house finally at peace, its stories finally heard, its past finally embraced. The Hendersons, bound by their shared experience, had not only found a home, but had become a part of its enduring legacy, a testament to the power of unity, acceptance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.